Welcome to the British Museum's Knowledge Share Spring Event Series 2021. These events seek to build on some of the conversations that were held at our National Programmes Conference in 2019, which explored equality and diversity in UK museum practice. We're delighted to host so many contributors from across the UK's cultural heritage sector, including several returning speakers from our 2019 conference. I'm grateful to the Vivmar Foundation for their long-term and valuable support of the Knowledge Share programme, which has made these events possible. And I thank you all for joining us as we explore the ways in which museums and heritage organisations have adapted to the profound changes of 2020 and look ahead to the changes yet to come.
Hello and welcome to the first event in our Knowledge Share Spring Event Series. It's great to have so many of you here with us. Thank you for coming. Before we start the session, I'm just going to run through a bit of housekeeping. So this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the BM Events YouTube channel afterwards if you want to catch up on anything. But for now, live, the chat function is open, so please do use that to get the conversation going. We want to create a safe environment for discussion and sharing ideas, so please follow the museum's code of conduct, which is protect privacy, please don't share anyone's personal information, stay on topic and be respectful. So I'm sure you're looking forward to getting started. So I'm going to hand over to Afzal, who's going to introduce our brilliant speaker to the stage.
Hello, I'm Afzal Khan and I will be your host for today. Welcome to the very first event of the Knowledge Share Spring Event Series. Please do get comfortable as we're in for a treat. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Richard Castle, who will be leading the session. Richard is a psychologist specializing in the people perspective of preparing for and responding to the unthinkable actually happening. This interest developed after he was badly injured in the 1999 Paddington rail crash while he was in the Royal Air Force. For the last 9 years, he has applied psychological first aid in several post-disaster settings in the UK and overseas, including in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. He is currently advising Gloucestershire County Council on using PFA to address the mental well-being implications of the coronavirus pandemic. Richard is looking forward to answering your questions at the end, so please do send them in using the Q&A function. I'll come back on screen at the end of the presentation to put your questions to him and we'll grill him together. Richard, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and good day everybody. An absolute privilege, I have to say, to be asked to open this series. Change in the museum sector. Well, it's certainly been an era of change, has it not, over the last year? And I don't just mean with coronavirus. While we've all been in our little lockdown cocoons, a lot has gone on that will have unsettled a lot of us. When I say a lot's gone on, we look at the impact of, amongst others, the death of George Floyd. We look at the erosion of confidence, perhaps, in authority. And of course, most recently, we look at the tragic death of Sarah Everard and what's going to come out of that. What I thought it would be useful to do in terms of how we look at COVID and everything else and how we respond to it is in terms of what we can do to support people who are in mental and emotional distress. And what I'm intending to do is trot through a few things that I hope you'll find interesting. Basically, understanding what I mean by psychological first aid, the place it has in supporting people in mental distress, and then the action principles, which are very straightforward and easily remembered. Look, listen, and link. And then we'll look again at just a touch on the communication skills that we could all use in our interface with the public and with other people. Briefly at vulnerable people, and also how we end PFA assistance before, of course, thinking about ourselves as well. So in terms of an overview, psychological first aid is not an idea on the back of the infamous cigarette packet. It is an evidence-based methodology. It originated through the World Health Organization and the International Federation of Red Crescent and Red Cross Societies as a means of helping people in the aftermath of disasters. And you can see some of them on the slide there. It was evolved early last year by the World Health Organization to actually provide a mechanism by which we could specifically support people as a result of the COVID pandemic. A couple of definitions, if I may, just to start us off, because we tend to bandy these words around. And the first one I'd like really to talk about is when we talk about crisis, and we're all capable of talking about crisis quite a lot, what do we actually mean? Well, in terms of psychological first aid's development, it was the large-scale collective trauma events affecting multiple people. So a good example of that would be the Ebola epidemic, which was the first time it was used for real, any big terrorist attack, and we've had enough of those in London, or a fire in an apartment block. And I use that because psychological first aid was used extensively in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire to help ascertain what the needs of the community were, rather than what everybody else thought the needs of the community were. But it can also be used for on an individual basis for people who've experienced traumatic events, for instance, the aftermath of a car accident, an assault, or indeed the loss of a close friend. And the final definition I'll give you, if I may, is what do we actually mean by trauma? Because we tend to bandy the word around when the cat has been sick on the carpet. And actually, when I'm talking about trauma, I can do no better than the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, who 100 years ago, almost the day actually, gave it the descriptor of being an event of such emotional significance, it simply smashes through the body's defenses and floods it with an uncontrollable anxiety. And the key word there is uncontrollable. So let's take this ahead and look at the specifically at the current crisis event, which is obviously COVID-19. And I would argue that, in fact, because it's a global pandemic and it can affect anybody, it is actually a trauma that we have all lived through, although we might not have called it that. And some of us, of course, or we will have lived through it, but we may have lost people who didn't. And the point about this is that from the UK's point of view, most people, if they turn their clocks back almost a year to the day, will remember the extreme state of anxiety that they felt at the time. And indeed, that has gone on for a prolonged period. And you can see on there the accompanying related issues that go with it. But the one I really want to focus on is the bottom one, which is the increased levels of anxiety, because we need to be very careful that we think of people who had a pre-existing mental health disorder, for instance, depression, for instance, psychosis, which is a distortion from reality. People who already had those or experiencing the symptoms of those conditions, whether they've been diagnosed or not, will have had another layer, if you like, of anxiety on top of that. What does that mean? It means that when they come to react, they're likely to be in a very emotive state. And this is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go through it line by line, you'll be pleased to hear. But this illustrates what the symptoms are, what the reactions are to emotional distress. And as you can see there, anxiety and expressed fear is number one on the list. And you go through the rest of the symptoms. People are likely to feel confused. And that, I would suggest to you, will go to all of us when we come to the end of our particular lockdowns and we venture out again. We should expect, if you like, to be more anxious than we were when we were going off to our places of work, or going to visit a museum, or going to do whatever we were going to do about 13 months ago. So we need to be aware of that, and that the people may present at a museum, at or wherever, with some of that symptomology going on. And this is where PFA can come in and actually help. So we've covered the bit about people's emotions, feelings, and behaviours being disrupted if they're exposed to a traumatic event, such as COVID-19 and the lockdown and everything that went with it. But they're going to have more of a positive mental health if, firstly, that they understand that the anxiety they're feeling is an entirely normal reaction to an abnormal event. And if I only had 10 minutes, I would stop now, because that is the most important point to bear in mind, that anxiety is entirely normal, and we need to be sympathetic to people who are displaying some of the symptomology I showed you earlier, simply because they're going through that normal reaction to an abnormal event. So they're likely, if we recognize that, they're likely to respond best if they feel connected with other people, feel someone actually cares about them, they feel safe, they're calm and hopeful, and know that there are sources of support and help available at the practical level, at the emotional level, and at the physical level. And what this is all about is not doing something to somebody. So we have, if you like, passive victims. It's about giving people or helping people to develop a sense of control so they're able to help themselves. So we've transformed them from passive victims to active survivors in the case of a disaster, or now just as they reapproach normality. And what does it involve? It involves practical care and support that's not intrusive. This is not a therapeutic approach. It is a methodology to think through how we help people, and it assesses people's practical and emotional needs and worries and helps them to address what their basic needs are at that particular moment in time. Now, in the aftermath of a disaster, typical disaster, it's quite easy. People want food, people want water, they may need clothes. Transform it forward to now, what are people likely to want? They probably will want a lot of reassurance when they enter a museum or they go into anything where they're likely to, or they feel even more anxious. They will need that reassurance. And that's again where PFA can come in and help. And key to it is an ability to listen effectively, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. So that's what we're trying to do. And what we're not trying to do, as I've already alluded to, is come up with a therapeutic or counselling approach. Absolutely not. It's not a tool that can only be delivered by people that are psychologists or have got some letters after their name. And it's most certainly not a way of being intrusive in terms of debriefing. And also, it's not pressurizing people to share their feelings. When is it relevant? Well, from the point of view of people who have a direct interface with the public in the museum sector, or indeed an interface with the public in any sector, it's on the first contact with someone who appears to be in a distressed state. And if we remember the rather busy slide I put on earlier with all the signs and symptoms of anxiety disorders and emotional distress, there are a lot of them around. So it's being alert to people who may be experiencing those symptoms. And it would normally be immediately after a crisis event. Well, a crisis event for some people will be getting out of the underground and heading towards, for instance, the British Museum. And leaving that side of it aside, the other area where it can be very helpful is in checking in with other members of our team, other members of our staff, our colleagues and our friends, to check that they're okay. So much for the preamble. Let's get into what we're actually trying to do here. And this comes in 5 stages. The first one is prepare. And that's making sure that we, as psychological first aid responders, if you like, are properly prepared for what we're going to do. So we need to know, we need to be sure that the environment that we're in is safe, that we know the details of a particular incident or where we are in terms of the COVID restrictions in the current climate, and know about what other sources are available to provide support for people. And what I will say right now is that if one does intervene on a PFA basis, it's really important that you have the time and that you yourself are calm before you leap in and help other people. Because all that would be, if you weren't, what would be likely to happen is a lot more friction. So that's preparing ourselves in a calm, reassuring manner. And the second one, the first principle, once we've prepared ourselves, is actually to look. And what are we looking for? We're looking for who is the most likely to need support to start off with, and critically, as I said before, the potential signs of distress and the likely needs of those affected. And we're reminding ourselves again of what the emotional reactions are that we saw earlier, so that we try and target, if you will, the right people. And in terms of looking at people's needs, what are they likely to need? They're likely to need practical and emotional support. If someone is distressed, the first thing they'll want is someone to actually recognize that they are in distress and have the confidence that that individual will be able to support them effectively. And also the situation people will find themselves in the setting that's on the slide there. If people have been in lockdown for a long period and they are emerging out, then they're going to need quite a lot of reassurance that it is safe to be outside. And we really shouldn't forget this one. It's been a very unnatural environment for all of us over the past year, and people are likely to react very emotionally. As I say, we emerge from the cocoon. And following on from that, the imagined or real risks that people may be experiencing. You will know as well as I do that some people don't see a need for masks at all. Other people get very fretful. There was an instance in the supermarket last week where there was a scene because someone was very upset that somebody else wasn't wearing a mask. So the amount of reassurance we can do, backed up by whatever scientific knowledge that is available through the government or any other reliable sources, is really important, because people will have their own purview, and if they become distressed as a result of it, then that's where psychological first aiders can be very supportive. So that's the look bit of it. And now on to the listen. And this bit, I think, is absolutely critical. What we're actually looking at here is making contact with people who need support and begin the conversation and introducing ourselves in a very calm and reassuring manner, assuring that person that we are concerned for them and that they can talk to us. And getting that confidence is normally relatively easy if we use calm and measured tones, we smile, and we're not at all threatening. And quite a good way of looking at it is this: approaching people respectfully and being aware of their safety and dignity. Introducing ourselves by name, can be first name only, that doesn't matter, what they're doing and which organisation they're from. So I'm Richard Castle, I work for the British Museum, and I'm looking after visitors today, for example. Very simple and straightforward. And then explaining what you're in a position to do to help. And what that's all about is getting across to that person that you recognise they look distressed, or if it's a friend or a family member, explaining they're not themselves, and you're there to do what you can do to help them. And of course, the first part of that talks about not being with you in person. And of course, still nowadays, we are dealing with people via talking to our friends and family via Zoom, via Cisco, WebEx, via MS Teams, etc. So you need to tailor that, but have the sort of the oral script ready to go. And then ask the person how they're feeling. Normally, when we see people every day, we say, "How are you?" If I meet people, I say, "How are you feeling today? How are you today? How are you feeling today?" Yeah, because that then immediately tunes them in that they're actually you are actually focusing on how they're feeling. So you don't hopefully get the answer, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you very much," which closes off the conversation very neatly. And you don't need to focus purely on their mental and emotional health. We also ask how their physical health is. And what this is doing, if you like, is normalizing emotional distress or disturbance in the same way as we would do someone who's got fractured ankle ligaments, and normalizing the physical response to that. And then staying with the person for as long as possible until they are in a safe place, or they've recovered sufficiently to be able to continue with their visit to the museum, or to go off and do whatever they want to do. So that's basically the structure of it. And just some little tips here. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'll just emphasize the main points. Whenever we're dealing with people or helping people, supporting people in emotional distress, the main thing is not pressuring that individual to talk or indeed to tell you their story. People will do that when they're good and ready. But it is useful exploring whether they have got somebody else that they can talk to. And I've put on there some calming techniques. The most effective one I use for people who are in a state of near panic or in emotional distress is called a grounding technique. And it's all about bringing people back into the here and now and realizing that actually there's no reason to be frightened. And this is the 5 things they can see. So asking people to describe 5 things they can see, 4 things they can hear, 3 things they can touch, 2 they can smell, and 1 they can taste. What's that doing? That's playing on the 5 senses, because in a state of anxiety or mental distress or emotional distress, it is the anxiety that will be the prime emotion that goes with it. So by using that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique, one's able to get them back in the here and now and hopefully in a more stable and comfortable frame of mind. It would be very unwise of me in 40 minutes or so to start to give a lecture on principles behind communication, but I will offer you this little bit here. And I'd ask you just to be honest with yourselves, when you're having a conversation with anybody, let's take the mental health aspect out of it. How many times do we actually listen to that individual thinking, how are we going to respond to what they're saying, rather than actually listening to understand what they're trying to tell us? And I can assure you there is a complete distinction, because normally in a conversation, one is listening to it and thinking, okay, what am I going to say next? Rather than, as I say, just listening to people to understand what they're trying to tell you. I hope that makes some sense. And the other principles below that are, if you like, the standard fare on good communication in the round. And also, of course, being aware when we're doing all this, of being aware of the cultural backdrop behind it. In some cultures, it's very wrong to touch people, particularly if you're from a different gender. So generally speaking, within the PFA fraternity, we try not to get involved, physically, although I have on occasions and did on occasions in the aftermath of Grenfell Tower fire. Sometimes a gentle touch on the shoulder, completely non-threatening, is a source of reassurance. But the general rule is try and avoid physical contact, and certainly avoid using any jargon. And the major principles behind this: let's acknowledge how people are feeling, and although it might seem over the top to us, actually that is how they're feeling, and in psychological first aid terms, that is how we need to respond to them. Remembering right at the outset, we were talking about respect and dignity. It can also be helpful, moving away from sort of the COVID, but generally when people are anxious, and some people are subject to panic disorders, actually asking them what has helped them before when they've been in a distressed state can be hugely helpful, and also give you a hint as a psychological first aider on how you can best support them and lead them forward. So we've done look, we've done listen, and the next one is link. And link refers to how we as practitioners in psychological first aid can assist. And that's by, as I've said before, giving relevant information, reassuring people that the provisions that, for instance, the Tate Museum has done to protect people in accordance with the government guidelines, it has all been done, ergo they are safe to enter the building. So reassurance, relevant and reliable information is good. And also, if outside the COVID setting, if people are very lonely or don't seem to have any support, then actually helping them to provide that support can be very good. And again, I come back to this point that a lot of people will have been literally in lockdown for the best part of a year and may have lost touch with a lot of their friends and indeed their family. I came across a case like that just the other day of someone who had not spoken to their son for over a year because this particular gentleman was fairly elderly and hadn't heard of Zoom, as indeed I hadn't a year ago for that matter. So just by simple things of being able to help put people in touch with people can be very helpful. And also, you know, tackling practical problems. In the early days of the lockdown and the pandemic, a number of neighbourhood networks sprung up to be able to do shopping for people who couldn't get out of the house at all, those who were shielding, for instance. And actually, although they were set up as neighbourhood networks and they were just doing what humane neighbours would do, what they were actually doing is addressing the basic needs of their neighbours under the framework of PFA, although they had no idea that they were doing it under that framework. And certainly, following on from that, being able to signpost people to services and to other help, making phone calls for them, offering to take them to the doctor, whatever it might happen to be, is the sort of practical. And what we're trying to do in all of this is, sorry, I missed that one, done the bit on it. What we're aiming to do is to help people to feel calm. And that, if you transpose it across again to the distressed individual who turns up at the door of a museum or an art gallery or wherever it happens to be, how we can help them to feel calm. And the first thing, again, is coming back to this fact of being able to produce reliable, calm information that will enable people to feel safe in the environment that they're in. So that's number one. And then, as you can see, it goes across from there. It's encouraging people to develop positive coping strategies. More of that in a second. And this is probably more relevant when we're talking about friends, family, work colleagues, that we can see are not the same person that they were 13 or 14 months ago when they came back to work. And actually promoting these positive coping strategies and taking away the negative ones, or seeking to reduce them, will be very good. And what we need to bear in mind that for anyone in distress, having a degree of social support available is going to be absolutely critical. So where we can, if they haven't got a family group or a partner to hand, then encouraging perhaps to get involved with faith groups, encouraging them to get involved with arts and culture. I mean, particularly in London, there's such a variety of things to do that people sometimes simply just need a nudge in the right direction. And when we've finished the intervention, be it simply a 5-minute application of PFA on the entrance to an art gallery, or whether it's at the end of 3 or 4 weeks, having dealt with a family member or a work colleague who's in a state of distress, then we always end our involvement as a PFA responder, at least, in a calm and positive way. Quite clearly, that's the aim of the thing, is to make people feel better and calmer rather than the other way round. Let me talk, if I may, briefly about positive coping strategies that there are available. And you'll have seen this sort of list before. What we're looking at is encouraging rest and sleep. The book says we should be asleep, as an adult at least, for 7.5 hours a night. Not easy, and I challenge most of us to do that on a daily basis. Eat regularly and eat healthily. And also another positive coping strategy is actually talking to friends, family and work colleagues, and in an environment where that individual knows that they're not going to be judged or mocked, which again plays into the PFA role. And to be able to have someone that they can talk to. Now, within the workplace environment, someone who's done the full psychological first aid responder course would be a good person, or indeed, and I'll come to this right at the end, someone who is a mental health first aider, who would have a wider background and knowledge about the various mental health disorders that are flying around. Good way of relaxing. It says here, sing, read and play with the dog. I would argue that we could add the cat to that. And actually, one that I've found recently that's come from absolutely nowhere is I've started writing short stories. So it's really whatever is a positive, someone feels positive about doing, that takes them away from the anxiety, the concerns that they've been dwelling on. And music generally, not just singing, can be great as well. Exercise, you'll hear everybody say this, but it's certainly true. And I'm not going to do the full sort of chemical or the neurochemistry bit at the minute, but there is no doubt that the chemicals that are released, A, when we laugh, incidentally, and B, when we undertake physical exercise, are extremely positive in promoting our mental well-being. So exercise, even if it's sort of 10,000 steps a day as a challenge to do 6 days a week, you would be amazed how more positive people feel. And that's certainly one of the places I always start with people that I come across who've been experiencing a mental health disorder or have been distressed for a long period of time. Avoid alcohol and non-prescription drugs. This does not mean, never have a beer, but we all know actually underneath it all that while, having a beer is great and we have a good social time and it loosens our inhibitions and all the rest of it, the actual chemicals in alcohol are depressants. So over a period of time and prolonged use, I'm sorry to be a party pooper, but actually prolonged use of alcohol is not a positive coping strategy, quite the opposite. Maintaining personal hygiene, and perhaps most of all, finding safe and productive ways that people can reach out to other people who will understand them non-judgmentally, which again takes us back to what PFA is all about. So having had that lot, it will come as no surprise that the other thing we do, which was on the earlier piece, is discourage negative coping strategies. So what have we got there? Well, practically the converse of what we had before. So we're looking at not taking, don't take, it says here, and quite rightly so, non-prescribed drugs, alcohol excessively, use alcohol excessively, or indeed caffeine. Don't sleep all day. Actually, sleeping all day isn't very helpful, just 6 to 7 hours. And in any workplace environment nowadays, I would hope that people are not asked to overwork without any rest or relaxation, because our bodies are not programmed to be at it for a full 8 hours and a go at a time. If you accept that we are all mammals, let me give you an example of another mammal. It would be a lion, or indeed a cat or a dog. The lions, cats and dogs sleep for 8 hours a day. Work for 8 hours a day. No, they don't. They go out and do a bit of hunting or whatever they get up to. Then they have a rest and they go and do a bit more hunting or whatever they get up to. It's also important that people don't lose contact with families and friends. One of the symptoms of both depression and anxiety is people very frequently withdrawing to themselves. And actually that's extremely negative in terms of a coping strategy, although unavoidable if people are in a state of depression at the time. And again, the opposite of what I said before, let's not neglect basic personal hygiene. So the link bit is not rocket science. What the link bit is about is giving people a prompt in the right direction so that they can either get support from other people, get support from professionals, or just think about how they're spending their days, exercising, having a due amount of rest, and eating healthily. And all of that will promote positive mental well-being, which is what we're trying to do within psychological first aid. So having done all that, we need to think about how we're actually going to end the specifics of psychological first aid support. This in some ways will be quite straightforward. If it's someone who is distressed on the entrance to, for the sake of argument, the National Gallery, then hopefully an intervention along the look, listen, link bit by someone who is confident in talking to that individual, enabling them to relax, actually ending the PFA support will be very quick. But in other settings, I come back to the change in personality of a family member, of a friend or a work colleague, actually this process can take a lot longer. So we need to think about the other person's needs and your own needs, because I can assure you providing PFA support on a prolonged basis can be very exhausting for you as a responder as well. So we need to use the best judgment to determine when it's the appropriate time to stop delivering PFA, having empowered that individual to get his or her own life going in a more positive strain. So what I would always do is, if I did specifically suggest something, for instance, a link into a veterans organisation for people who've been in the armed forces, for instance, I'd make absolutely sure that they either had made contact with them or that they had the right telephone number or website address, whatever it was. And always reiterate the positive progress that has been made over the time you've been together. And that would also go for the 5-minute session at the entrance to the National Gallery as well. And as ever, the break off, if you like, should be meaningful and it should be positive. Within a workplace environment, I think it would be sensible, and this again is much more mental health first aid than psychological first aid, but to have a follow-up conversation with that individual and arrange it in advance that you'll go for a walk in St James's Park, in 3 weeks, and just do a check-in as how things are going. I mentioned before that being involved in the response to any form of disaster, or indeed to an individual in distress, you need to be aware of the toll that can take on you as an individual, and make provision to ensure that you don't damage your own mental well-being in the process. So it's good, again, to follow the same sort of principles. If there are a group of people who are delivering psychological first aid, it's good of you for you all to get together over a cup of tea or coffee or whatever. I remember what I said about alcohol before, but just to get together and see how it's going. It's a useful check-in. And it's also useful to reflect on what's gone well and what hasn't gone well. And also, it says here, have your own self-care plan. What I tend to do after I've had a day of sort of getting involved in the aftermath of something like Grenfell or a train crash or wherever it happens to be, is actually taking a deliberate time out for myself and just seeing, how stressed I actually am. Am I behaving normally, or am I going home still wound up by involvement in the event, and metaphorically at least kicking the cat? And also, and if I do find that I am in the mood for metaphorically kicking the cat, then I have a list of close mates I can ring up, and I can tell them how I'm feeling, and I've had a really good experience or a poor experience. So don't forget the toll that supporting other people in mental distress can have on you as someone who's been kind enough to intervene. To finish off with, some people will need a lot more than psychological first aid. Quite clearly, people who've got life-threatening illness, or people who can't care for themselves, who are at risk of self-harm or express suicidal ideation, or who might hurt or engender other people. That's not one for psychological first aid, and I wouldn't pretend it was. It's not even one for mental health first aid, quite frankly. So I must put the rider up there so there's no confusion. If someone is in an extremely distressed state and you believe they could be at risk of harming themselves or other people, then it's emergency assistance, it's 999, and get on with it. If it's somebody you know, family, neighbour, or work colleague, then establishing contact with the local NHS crisis resolution and home treatment team and helping them to do it, doing it for them if they can't do it themselves, is the best way forward, rather than trying to take on more than we can all chew as amateurs. And we also, this is particularly relevant in the response to COVID, but also from the workplace point of view. There are some people who are likely to be a lot more vulnerable than others, and you can see a list there. And it's the bottom one, actually, that I give particular credence to in relation to COVID. As I said right at the outset, that people who have got pre-existing physical and mental health conditions are those who will have had this extra layer of COVID-related stuff placed on top of it, who are at most risk of distress as the majority of the world reaches some form of new normality within the next 2 or 3 months. So we just need to be cautious. People just be aware that people who are experiencing or have got any diagnoses along those lines are likely to require that additional bit of emotional support as opposed to just physical support. Okay, we'll start to pull this all together. Summary of PFA action principles. I'm not going to go through the whole list again, but I've primarily put it in there so that if you want to refer to it again when it goes online, you can look at it in more depth. But nevertheless, it's the 5 stages. It's the preparing ourselves to be able to intervene successfully. It's principle 1, look for people in distress using the sort of symptomology I showed you earlier. It's listening to them and listening effectively and without judgment to them, and then linking them, and then not forgetting at the end of the day that we also need to look after ourselves as well. Okay, so if you remember nothing else, what would I like to think that you remembered? I'd like to think you remember that psychological first aid is a structured, evidence-based set of principles or a framework for identifying and supporting people in distress, and particularly following a crisis or a traumatic event. And I mentioned to you earlier that in my book, COVID comes under that heading. I offer you again that description by Freud of what trauma actually means, and that uncontrollable anxiety that people who've been through a trauma will feel is absolutely normal, and we should expect that and reassure people that they will go through after, if you like, a standard disaster such as a train crash. They will have 6 to 8 weeks where they're not functioning properly, but then, like torn ankle ligaments, the brain will heal in much the same way. And people will have more positive mental health if they engage, well, firstly, they understand the normal reaction to an abnormal event, and then have the opportunity to connect with other people who actually do care about them. And that, I would suggest, is all rational human beings who would like to look after their fellow human beings. I've spoken about look, listen, and link enough, and I make no apology for just repeating this bit about how when we listen to people in this sort of setting, we need to listen to understand, and not just think, how on earth am I going to reply to this? Which, as I say, if we're honest, a lot of us will do. Let's not forget the needs of vulnerable people, and self-care at the end of the day is all paramount. So as I bring this to a conclusion, I work for an organisation called Plan for Mental Health, which is a division of Plan for Sport, and we do packages along these lines if anyone ever wants to hear another one or in more depth on PFA. I would also the link there to the on the World Health Organization website I've put on there as well, together with that of Mental Health First Aid England. And as I mentioned briefly, Mental Health First Aid England provide evidence-based courses which enable people to successfully intervene when people are experiencing mental health disorders, such as depression, such as anxiety disorders, such as eating disorders, probably the most misunderstood of all mental health disorders, and indeed psychosis, distortion from reality. And thoroughly recommended, but either on an individual or organisational basis. And if there are any queries coming out of all this, I'm more than happy, if it doesn't come to you in the remainder of this webinar, please feel free to get in touch with me direct. And that's psychological first aid. Thank you very much. I make no apology for the picture on the right. That happens to be my favourite museum in the country, which most people recognise as being in Newcastle. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard, for your very enlightening and very pertinent presentation. And it's a discussion I think we all need to be having. And we've had some very good interesting comments. We had someone that said, this is a really important presentation, as I've worked on a gallery and a visitor has had a panic attack in front of me and I didn't know how to react on the spot. And someone also said, fantastic, very clear and effective advice. So thank you very much, Dr. Richard.
Absolute pleasure.
Okay, and we can just get straight into the questions. We have some very interesting questions here. One of the questions is, do you have any experience of working with people with autism and related conditions and delivering PFA for those people? If so, do you have advice on how I could incorporate this in awareness training? Yeah,
the short answer is yes, I do. The slightly longer answer, to answer the second point, is it's mainly a question to me of establishing eye contact. That is the start of it. I mean, we're all on the autistic spectrum. I mean, let's be honest about that from the start. But I hear entirely where this individual is coming from. It's establishing eye contact, and if I would say one thing, it's not doing what I'm really good at, which is really long sentences with lots of commas, lots of semicolons, and all the rest of it. It's really short, sharp questions on which there can be no misunderstanding, although you may need to repeat it 2 or 3 times. So, how are you feeling today? That's a sort of very straightforward approach, is a really good opening gambit, and as much reassurance as possible. I mean, that's really where I would start off with that one. But I'd be more than happy if that individual wants to email me separately. I'm happy to go into more depth, but in the sort of general setting, I think what we need to do is just focus on the main points. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. We have another question that's asked, what are the best reliable sources to learn more about psychological first aid?
Unquestionably, the authoritative one is the one that there was a link on the, I think, 3 slides from the end, which is the World Health Organization, because they're the main proponents of it, and that link would do it. Otherwise, if you Google, if you Google psychological first aid and then either put World Health Organization after it and hit the push button, hit the search button, or the International Federation of Red Crescent and Red Cross Societies, they actually produced the sort of detailed guidelines beneath the World Health Organization framework.
Okay, perfect. And another question is, I get the feeling that front of house members of staff will be really important in ensuring the psychological well-being of members of the public. What would you recommend for bringing PFA into front of house roles?
Right, well, the first thing, which I in my experience in going into the museum, certainly in London and Newcastle, and to a lesser extent Bristol, you do it already in terms of already being assured, welcoming and smiling. This does seem to be the culture of people that work certainly on the front of house, the sort of reception side and where you buy your ticket. You're doing that bit already, you're providing that assurance. What I would suggest is that people, I have no idea how many people are watching this, but if there's one person from every museum, then quite clearly the principles underpinning psychological first aid, which I say again, it's not rocket science. It's look, listen, link. Having done homework in advance on the signs and symptoms that people could display, having a time set aside for quote staff training unquote. I'm not sure how it works in the museum sector, and actually just going for an hour, possibly through much the same sort of talk that I've given this afternoon, so that they understand what is the normal reaction to an abnormal event. that people are likely to display the sort of signs and symptoms I put up earlier when they venture out of lockdown, they come off the tube or the bus or however they get there and walk into what was previously their normality. When I used to live in London, I used to love going to wander around the art galleries with friends at a weekend. I used to love it. It was my normality. If I was still living in London, it certainly would not be my normality for the last 13 months. And when I would go back in them today or tomorrow or after April the 11th or whenever it is, I am going to feel more anxious about going into a gallery than I would have done before. And I would suggest that would go for the whole of the 65 million population of the UK. So the more that the staff are aware that everyone is going to react in a normal way to a very abnormal set of circumstances, displaying that sort of symptomology and having the confidence, perhaps through role play, if time allowed, with other members of staff, to actually how would they make that opening gambit to people to be able to support them. And that's some of the stuff I would put on, particularly on the listen section of this talk today.
Okay, and now we have quite an interesting question. Someone asks, we have a noose as part of the collection and there's no warning. It might trigger some visitors. Any advice on how best to advise people on it?
I missed the start of that. I'm sorry. Could you just repeat the start of that?
Sorry, yeah. We have a noose as part of the collection and there's no warning.
Oh, okay.
It might trigger some visitors.
Yeah, and actually I completely get that one. I mean, I used to be in the armed forces, and in my day I spent some time in Northern Ireland. And the reason I mention that is I took the family over to Northern Ireland for a holiday 20 years after I'd been there. And we went round the main prison in Belfast at the time. And we went through the end of a corridor. And the curator there said, okay, we're now going to see where people were hanged. And I thought, I'm going to be fine. My wife, took the younger children. They didn't go in. And I went to my oldest son. And I was struck by the impact that had on me. So I completely get where this question is coming from. What I would say is that I would imagine that already you can't just sort of wander in and see the noose. I mean, perhaps you can, but I'd be surprised because I would have thought there would have been some form of trigger warning, and I'm a great believer in spelling things out in words of one syllable, along the lines of, in the next room, you're going to see a noose that was possibly used, or probably used, whatever the historical backdrop is to it, which was probably used to hang prisoners, to hang murderers, dare I say it, to hang slaves in olden times. And if you think it might be triggering, you might want not to look at that exhibition. What I'd be more concerned about, actually, following that question, is from people who did have a connection, who deliberately went to see that particular exhibit, knowing it might trigger them, but they saw it as important to do so. And I think if we look at some of the lessons that I've certainly learned, and I think the world has learned, that's come out of George Floyd, the Black Lives Movement, Windrush, and all that's gone with that, the potential there is for people to be very upset because their awareness and emotions are heightened anyway. So other than having very clear advice to people what they're going to see when they see it, I would also make sure that the curators who were looking after that particular area did know about psychological first aid and had some measure of training in how to help people if they were going through, did have a panic or an adverse emotional reaction, which is one of the reasons, if I'm honest, that I included that little bit about the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 bit, because I've yet to find anybody that once you get into a safe space and actually ask them to tell you 5 things they can see and actually describe them to you. So not just a tree, but okay, what colour is the tree? What shape is it? So really focusing the senses on the reality in front of them now, and then through the other 4 senses as well. That is an extremely effective way of calming people down. Does that help at all?
That's perfect. We have one more question. I think this is going to be our final one. Okay. Hi, Richard. I think you mentioned a training in PFA. Who offers this?
Training in PFA is largely self-taught in the current era from the International Federation of Red Crescent and Red Cross Societies website, and you can download a training package from that, and they do indeed offer it. Psychological first aid is also offered through, we certainly offer it through Gloucestershire County Council. There's a training package that is available for everybody. But that was done, if I'm honest, the one for Gloucestershire was done by me, having pulled it out of the International Federation of Red Crescent and Red Cross Societies and transforming it into a package that's useful. And our model was actually then taken on by Public Health England. So there is, I believe, I wouldn't swear to it because I haven't looked myself, but I think if you also put in psychological first aid, Public Health England, you might also find a training package that's not very unlike the one in Gloucestershire. If I could just have a final word on this, it's great to be able to do this webinar on PFA, and I much appreciate it. But there is no substitute for actually having someone deliver it in person. If you're an organisation, you're looking to get a queue of people, to a team of people who are actually competent, to actually give them a training package that includes PFA or the mental health first aid package, if you want to take the wider perspective, that is by far the most effective means of getting the message across.
All right, so thank you very much to Dr. Richard for his brilliant presentation. And we have many more events coming over the next 10 weeks or so, I think. So please do keep a lookout for them. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope it was as enlightening for you as it was for me. And yeah, thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.
Stay safe, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you.